Thank you very much, first of all, to the offline team for making this happen. Right. I mean, clearly, as Sarvagya mentioned, there's a lot of chatter around dematerialization, a lot of hullabaloo as well. And information asymmetry is probably the right word to understand here. And hopefully we're able to unpack some of the things around dematerialization throughout this session. Second, of course, thank you very much to the offline participants for joining in. I've had the pleasure of interacting with some of you in the past as well. I'm gonna start sharing my screen and effectively take you all through a quick slider of sorts. Is it being shared? Is it visible? Yes, amazing. Right. So the idea of this session is to talk about dematerialization, the mandate around it, the process, try to simplify it as much as possible. But also, essentially, by the end of this session, touch upon some of the exciting shifts in the security issuance rails that most likely the Indian ecosystem will start undergoing, and it already has to some some effect. The agenda we've already spoken about. We'll cover dematerialization, just like a brief history. What exactly is it? Why is it important? Eligibility that it befalls on, and just compliance and penalties, of course. A quick intro, as Sarvagya has already mentioned, I am a operator. I'm building EquityList. We're building a definitive operating system for equity management, trusted by 400 plus companies throughout India, Southeast Asia, MENA, cross-border US. And we work with startups, large businesses, even listed players of all shapes and sizes. And as we help companies manage their cap tables, stock options, and related compliances, clearly dematerialization for our Indian customers was a problem statement that was just a no-brainer for us to build around. And in fact, a few months ago, we actually launched dematerialization as a service, probably the only cap table players to do so. Nice. So yeah, so what is dematerialization, right? Like just the basics of it. And honestly, like literally, like dematerialization is nothing but a conversion of physical share certificates into securities that are held in an electronic form, right? So let's say as of today, if a company is issuing shares to any shareholders, you effectively print out a share certificate, procure a stamp paper, right? Do all of the paperwork and filings around it. Then you either issue the certificate to the shareholder by courier, etc. Especially if they're large institutions, they may require you to share the certificates with them. Or maybe as a startup, you might as well just like maintain a record, a physical record of all of these share certificates, lying somewhere in your admin storage for years of building a company. And the problem, effectively, of course, with physical issuances of shares, I think first and foremost has to be, I think, the most literal sense, the most obvious sense, which is just safekeeping of these share certificates is quite a task, right? And as you embark on a journey to build a company for almost a decade or even longer, there are abundant of cases around all of us where certificates get lost, stolen, right? And then there's a lot more compliance around it, but mostly, of course, there's a lot of ambiguity with the regulators as well. And there have been unfortunate incidents at a supremely large scale, historically in the nation as well, where fraudulent activities have very easily ridden on this physical security form factor. And this is where dematerialization really comes into the picture, which effectively abstracts away the complexity of, hey, I have to give you a share certificate. I would rather just essentially generate unique identifiers for every share class, which are called ISINs, and I'll come to that later, and just push the respective shares into my shareholders' demat accounts, right? And that's such a beautiful workflow, right? Mostly around dematerialization, many people believe that it's just a new mandate that's come out of nowhere. But the fact of the matter is that this has probably been in works for quite some time, right? So in late 1990s, the Depository Act of 96 was introduced, where of course CDSL and NSDL were effectively created around that point of time. And around 2000 is when MCA and SEBI mandated that any company which is listing itself and going for an IPO has to mandatorily dematerialize their shares. And up until 2023, the mandate of dematerializing shares was, of course, only applied at listed players or even unlisted public companies, companies, entities that have more than 200 LPs, 200 investors, right, that fall into that category. So it was only mandatory for such cohorts of companies where you had to dematerialize. But of course, in 2023, there were amendments made into the Companies Act, where even private companies, unlisted companies that cross a certain threshold are now required to dematerialize their shares, and hence why we are discussing dematerialization as well. Let's talk about the eligibility, right? It's quite simple. Dematerialization is exempt for any company that is categorized as a small company by MCA and Companies Act definition, or any government body, right? So, for example, any company that either that has a paid up capital which exceeds 4 crores in value and an annual turnover of more than 40 crores needs to dematerialize. So this condition of 4 crores of paid up capital and 40 crores of annual turnover is pretty much that quantifiable benchmark threshold that I think all of you, who are part of the session can introspect and ask themselves whether this mandatorily applies to you or not. Similarly, over and above this, even if you do not meet this threshold, if you're a company with multiple subsidiaries, if you're a NBFC yourself, or you're an Indian subsidiary of a foreign holding entity, then you have to dematerialize. Even if your paid up capital is supremely low, let's say paid up capital of less than 1 lakh, 2 lakh, or turnover in your Indian subsidiary of less than whatever, like just to run like your basic operations. It doesn't matter. You'll have to dematerialize. Any questions so far, by the way? If not, we can always take up questions later on as well.
Hi, Kashish. Ayush here from.
Hey, Ayush. Hi.
Just want to understand in this front. I can see if you see the first part, it is mentioned private companies, including Indian subsidiaries of foreign firms, and down it is mentioned if you are an Indian subsidiary of a foreign entity, then you have to get a share dematerialized, and in that case, this limit will not be applicable. So not able to understand, because firstly we are saying foreign firms and down we are saying foreign entity. So foreign entity means foreign corporation only, or in foreign firms like LLP also will cover here?
Right. It's talking about any type of body corporate. Could be an LLP, could be a C corporation, could be any structure that has a foreign holding entity to it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So basically, the 4 crores of paid up capital and 40 crores of turnover pretty much applies to wholly owned or just like typically Indian parent headquartered companies in general. But if you are a subsidiary of a foreign holding entity or an NBFC, then it doesn't matter, right? Like then irrespective of the threshold, whether you even exceed this, quantifiable threshold or not, you have to dematerialize.
Okay. So my point is that why we are mentioning private companies, including Indian subsidiary of foreign firm, because if it is an Indian subsidiary of foreign firm, then it's mandatory to get a dematerialized. Then this limit will not be applicable, correct? First one, that paid up capital and annual turnover.
Got it. Sorry. So you're saying that when we say including Indian subsidiary of a foreign firm with a paid up capital.
Correct. So this should not come, because if it's an Indian subsidiary of foreign firm, anyway, they need to get a dematerialized, correct?
That's correct. But that's precisely the point as well, right? I mean, we could definitely refactor the language, but I mean, that's precisely what's written in the bullet points as well. Is there clarity around there, or is there ambiguity still?
No, I got a clarity. I just little confused previously, actually. Now it's fine.
Okay, awesome. Right. So which are the different stakeholders or entities that are involved in this entire dematerialization process? Other than, of course, the company and its shareholders, right? You have 3 major, like stakeholders that are relevant throughout the process. The first and foremost are the RTAs. These are intermediary bodies that effectively are responsible for managing all of your security transaction records, administrative tasks, etc. And the only bodies that can directly speak with the depositories as well. Depositories on your right side, of course, are CDSL or NSDL. responsible for, of course, holding all of your electronic securities, etc. And in the middle, you have the depository participants, also called the DPs. These are the players that will help you open up your demat accounts. So you can't directly go to CDSL and be like, hey, here you go. Here are the shares that I want you to store on my behalf. You effectively, of course, have to go through an RTA to start this entire process, and we'll come to the workflow later, but you have to go through the RTA to start the entire process, simultaneously open your demat account, right? And then liaise with the RTAs to push the data to the depository and get the shares into your HDFC Securities, Zerodha, Grow, Dhan, etc. demat accounts that you would have created for yourself. Right. So in a typical workflow, right, step one would be where you first pick your transfer agent. Transfer agent, as we showed in the last slide, are folks like K-Fintech, CDSL Ventures, Lincoln Time, and then there's like a whole long tail list of some boutique transfer agents, etc. as well that you can work along with. But clearly, K-Fintech, CDSL Ventures, Lincoln Time are probably some of the most reputed players in the country. So the first step, of course, is that you choose your transfer agent and you start preparing a list of, there is a prerequisite document list, a checklist of sorts that is absolutely mandatory for dematerialization. That checklist is honestly not too complex. It starts off with your basic company details, where you have to share your MOA, AOA, certificate of incorporation, basic GST, certificates, your latest net worth statement, and effectively your cap table as well, right? Like streamline your cap table. How many active outstanding securities do you have? What kind of share classes and different types of securities are we talking about, right? Listing down how many, let's say, equity holders you may have, CCPS holders, CCDs, NCDs, etc. So a complete breakdown of your cap table. And that's the first step. The first step is to pretty much streamline all of that data together and, of course, pick your transfer agent. Similarly, in parallel, highly important for a company to understand on which depository do they need to dematerialize their shares. So just as a quick refresher, depositories are either NSDL or CDSL. And it's absolutely not mandatory for you to dematerialize on both of these networks. You can just choose one. The question is, and the key, the practical, for all practical purposes, what companies have to first figure out is that all of their shareholders are on their cap table. Do they have demat accounts on both of these depositories, or is it consolidated and clustered on one? So for example, if all of your majority of your demat accounts are just there on your CDSL, then there's no point for you to dematerialize your shares on NSDL, right? Then you'll effectively be forcing all of your shareholders to open fresh demat accounts on NSDL as well, right? Which is a pretty cumbersome process. You'll have to explain this decision making to your shareholders, and that just increases the complexity. So step two, once you select your transfer agents, you make hopefully a data-backed decision on which depository that you need to dematerialize first. Once you have, as I said, collated all of the prerequisite documents that you've shared with your transfer agent, the transfer agent is the only body that's allowed to directly speak with the depository. You yourself cannot reach out to CDSL and NSDL and be like, here you go, here's all of the information, etc. Can you make this happen for me? The transfer agent is the one responsible for carrying out that act. And the reason you are effectively like sharing all of these documents, etc., is because the first step of dematerialization is for you to create ISINs, which are International Securities Identification Number. These ISINs are, as it states, globally recognized unique codes that identify, like a particular security of the security that you have issued as a company. So let's say a hypothetical example, there's a Series A startup where, of course, there are common stockholders. The company has raised, a seed round, issued CCPS there. They have raised maybe a pre-Series A, and then they have raised a Series A, right? And maybe, in between, they may have just raised capital through, NCDs or optionally convertible debentures, etc. So clearly, there are already different four types of share classes. Then there could be additional, like non-convertible debentures or, CCDs, compulsory convertible debentures, different types of securities. So for every different class of securities that you have actually issued to your shareholders, you'll need to generate a unique ISIN number for each of them. And that honestly is phase one of your dematerialization process, which is getting that unique ISIN created. And I'm pretty sure you must have seen like a lot of the offline members would be public market investors, etc. So you would have seen these in your like beneficiary position statements that you get from all of your public holdings. Every share that you've invested in the public market will also have ISIN associated with it. So it's a very unique identifier of the security that you're issuing. Once your ISINs are created, the next step is to open the demat account for the company itself, right? And this is where the depository participants come into the picture. Once your ISINs are created, you have a company demat account opened, of course. The next step is that you have to now start coordinating with your shareholders, right? As I said, the share certificates could be lying anywhere. The physical share certificates that you've issued, right? Maybe you have couriered them to your shareholders years ago, or maybe you are keeping them, within your office premises, etc. The idea is that you'll have to collate all of those outstanding physical share certificates in one place. You will have to fill out a DRF form, which is a dematerialization request form. You'll have to fill that out. These DRF forms, your depository participants will provide to you. So for example, as a shareholder in a company, if my depository account is with HDFC Securities or ICICI Securities, then I could go to their website and I could just like simply Google search ICICI Securities DRF form, and I'll get a very templatized form that as a shareholder I'll need to fill out. And it's going to ask me very basic details, right? It's going to ask me how many shares do I own in a company, right? Like the type, the number of shares, so on and so forth. And these details, the company admins, the cap table managers within the startup or within the company will be able to assist the shareholders with. So yeah, sorry. This effectively is the entire dematerialization workflow as we speak, right? Phase one of this entire workflow is generating ISINs for different share classes, for different types of securities that are outstanding within your organization. Phase two is that once ISINs are created, you collate all of the existing share certificates, you're couriering them, you're sending them to the depository participant, which further then sends it to the depository, of course. And in effect, what's happening is they're destroying those physical shares. And then they're pushing the shares electronically into the demat accounts of individual shareholders. Any questions so far? Got it. Maybe not. I'll just move forward. Right. So I get it. Like other than the compliance angle, where companies and startups have now been forced to dematerialize their shares by 30th of September this year, which, by the way, we are not sure. Maybe the deadlines could extend, or for all practical purposes, maybe they could, because a lot of companies are in the pipeline trying to get through it. We genuinely believe that there are, of course, tremendous benefits to this, right? For a company, first and foremost, you are massively reducing the overhead of issuing these physical shares, maybe storing them, distributing them, ensuring their safekeeping for the lifetime of your company building journey. And there are so many startups that you speak with who have been operating for the past 4 to 5 years, where they have lost share certificates. They're just not sure where the share certificates are, right? So maybe if a company has 50, 80, 100 investors on their cap table, and there's no structured single source of truth which tells them where the share certificates lie, are they still intact, etc. It becomes a pretty cumbersome process, because then you have to follow, you effectively have to file an FIR, you have to create a duplicate share certificate. It's just a lot of unnecessary overheads of maintaining these physical, securities. Second, of course, for investors, honestly, being on the other side of the table as an angel or a fund manager, it's always been a pretty broken experience, being a shareholder or being an investor in the unlisted space and not being able to see all of my shares collated in one single place, in a digital form. So far, of course, all of your angel investors, VCs, etc., still have they're still maintaining all of this data on cap table, softwares, or they're maintaining all of this data in Excel sheets, or maybe like the physical proof of the share certificates. They're storing this somewhere, which of course is pretty ephemeral, right? It's ephemeral. B, it's just still not the best way for any individual investor to visualize and account for things. And don't get me wrong, right? You still need maybe like a software solution to manage your entire digital register, your cap table, etc. But knowing that there is a regulated workflow and a process where all of my shares are stored and safely kept, that itself is of a big benefit. And third, of course, regulators have been trying to create policies and pretty much bring in regulations which will ensure a streamlined, like progression of how the ecosystem should work, of how securities should be issued out, to like curb any illicit activities. Maybe potentially in the future, right? Like introduce policies for companies that have maybe dematerialized their securities, give them some sort of benefits, right? Bring in some sort of tax efficiencies, etc., or at least valuation requirements. So, I mean, clearly, like being on the good side of the regulatory front and ensuring that you're compliance ready, etc., that itself has its own benefits. Apart from just the low-hanging fruits, honestly, right? Dematerialization for all, like for just like all optimistic purposes, is unlocking a pretty interesting milestone in the Indian private markets. So far, as I said, it's been a pretty fragmented, disjointed workflow of being a shareholder in a company or as a company issuing securities to your investors. The timelines are super lengthy. The process is super erroneous. It's highly viable to human errors throughout this entire process of maintaining a shares register, creating share certificates, share certificates being lost in transfer, etc. It's unfortunate. Speak with any marquee angel investor or speak with any investor who has been operating the ecosystem for quite some time, and you will realize that most of the investors and shareholders are clueless where the certificates are. The company admins, of course, keep migrating and churning over the course of company building, and they themselves aren't sure of a lot of these details, which of course is highly concerning. So imagine a future in the Indian ecosystem where effectively companies will be able to fundraise in a supremely streamlined fashion, create their demat accounts all through this electronic journey, and then push shares directly into a shareholder's demat, right? Where the shareholder gets like some sort of real-time notification. They get to see everything within their brokerage apps, etc. And of course, as a company who's issuing securities, you are able to verify the details. We were chatting with a lot of, of course, over the past few months, we have spoken with a lot of founders when we migrate their, cap tables and get them started on dematerialization. And it's once again pretty concerning that there are a lot of just human errors in accounting of securities as well. When companies are filing documents, allotment documents on the MCAs website, right? It's honestly not surprising, and it happens way too often where they have misfiled or misreported the number of shares that they've actually, the number of shares that they've actually issued to a particular shareholder. And then later on, someone discovers it, and the shareholder then goes back to the company to try rectify, etc. Right? So the ability to ensure that all of these possibilities are pretty much reduced, that's a game changer. There are three or four things that we believe are supremely exciting. First and foremost, now investors investors within the unlisted space will be able to pledge their shares, or rather, let me correct, they'll be able to pledge their unlisted shares. Not that none of this wasn't possible before as well. Even today, if you Google search, you'll find a lot of credible banks or even NBFCs of some sorts who will give loan against securities, right, on unlisted shares. But of course, it's always been effectively supremely difficult to underwrite these unlisted shares for a lot of shareholders. Why? Because there's just never been great paperwork and records formed around these unlisted shares, right? But once your shares are in demat account, it opens up the possibility of you pledging your shares and getting loans against those shares as collaterals. Not to mention, there are a lot of innovative products that are being built in the ecosystem, which will also benefit employees who effectively receive ESOPs and who exercise their stock options to convert them into shares, right? So the ability to pay for all of these tax liabilities, etc., upfront by pledging your shares and becoming a shareholder into the company, it's quite exciting. None of this has ever happened in India before, right? But this opens up the possibility for all of these transactions to take place. Second, of course, as we see in the ecosystem, there are a lot of companies that are effectively going public. They intend to go public for all the right, or pretty much for all the right reasons, of course. And dematerializing your shares brings you one step closer, towards ensuring that you don't have to do all of this at the very end once you do have to list yourself. B, ensure that the complexities don't increase eventually later on, and in some fashion operate like how like a listed company to an extent should be operating. Although of course SEBI regulations do not fall, by the way, for dematerialized private companies. That's a big disclaimer that I want to share, unless where necessary. Third, of course, as I've mentioned, employees hopefully will be able to exercise their ESOPs much more seamlessly. Companies will be able to just push shares into employees' demat accounts supremely seamlessly, right? So it pretty much reduces that paperwork, and it allows companies to ensure that employees are actually thinking from a ownership mindset a lot more than just owning ESOPs and not having an opportunity to convert them into shares. And of course, right, ultimately staying compliant, and hopefully dematerialization has opened up avenues of just like streamlining a lot of fundraising processes, because everything is pretty much like done and dusted with. You have a single repository, so it just makes paperwork supremely streamlined.
I had a question, Kashish.
Yep.
So I mean, we've witnessed some really big data breaches and cyber attacks in the past, right? Within the crypto space primarily, but now that everything is getting digitized in the private security space also, how do you think, how can a company ensure a balance between the efficiency of a digital management ecosystem alongside the vulnerability that it, kind of offers? Because these are going to be the real shares of a company. So
yep. Honestly, I'm not a infosec or like whatever expert in general, but my 2 cents would be that just by the virtue of dematerializing your securities, first of all, you're not engaging with any random parties throughout this transaction, right? Like if I were to pull up these logos, you're dealing with credible institutions throughout the process, which hopefully have like the gold standard benchmarks around security protocols, etc. Like the right infrastructure to fend off vulnerability threats, right? And hopefully a lot more. So from that perspective, I think you're already in good hands. You're effectively just participating in this flow to mitigate any potential losses, like either in terms of monetary or like in terms of opportunity cost. Dematerialize your physical shares, engage with these institutional, like pretty reputed institutional bodies, which some of them are governed and regulated, and they get proper licenses, etc. And then effectively just push the shares, get it out of your plate, put it into theirs, right? That's the way I see it, and I believe that's how the regulators also see it, right? Like I think the whole idea is that regulators understand that as a company, it's very difficult to ensure that everything is supremely compliant. So why don't you just like push these shares into like regulated hands and let them kind of do the safekeeping for you to ensure that everything is like kosher and correct. As far as I believe, like, so from the vulnerability and just generally, like from a infosec perspective, I think the onus increases further on these bodies actually, rather, that they really up their game, which I'm pretty sure it's a constant endeavor for everyone. In the adjacent space of just, I would say, in the adjacent space of precaution and taking some sort of cautionary methods, I would suspect that, I would suggest that, you have limited depository participants you can work with. You have only 2 depositories that you can work with, which are either CDSL or NSDL. But there are a lot of RTAs out there, right? That companies are working with. And in our practical experience, it's best to work with the reputed RTAs at least.
Got it.
See, because here the problem, of course, throughout this process is that you can seriously mess up your dematerialization workflow if you don't exactly understand the company's cap table first, right? There have been a lot of cases where like some small RTA, etc., or newly licensed RTA has suggested a company to dematerialize and create, I don't know, like 15, 20 ISINs. Right, it's a astounding number for like less than a pre-series A company for it to undergo. Why? Lack of practical experience, a good amount of ambiguity in general, or just lack of super professionalism, right? So it's always at least recommended to work with supremely reputed RTAs who know exactly what they're doing, who have been there, done that, to help you to ensure that whatever data that you push, while you send everything in the most in the most streamlined fashion, they are still able to at least like look at that, verify that data, and then further push it to the depositories to work on your dematerialization process.
Got it. I think we have a question. Yush has a question. It's in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Shareholders generally have existing demat accounts for listed company shares. So is it mandatory to have a new demat account for private company shares? Hey, Ayush. So this is what I was trying to, So basically, you from our understanding, of course, you do not need to create a separate demat account per se, right? What's important is that you need to align the company's choice of depository with the demat account that the shareholder owns. So for example, if I am an existing shareholder and I have a demat account which is operational on NSDL, right? I would ideally want all of my securities, be it of unlisted or listed, to be there in one place, one consolidated place where I can see everything, right? But if the company, let's say, chooses to dematerialize on CDSL, right, then I'll be forced to create a new demat account. So that's why when a company is thinking about dematerialization and when the company is about to do a prep work for it, it's always recommended to effectively understand the lay of your own land. How many shareholders am I going to deal with? How many of these are foreign shareholders? How many of these are domestic shareholders? Reaching out to them to understand, if they do have demat accounts, on which depository are those demat accounts? What are those demat account details? Pretty much conduct like a survey of sorts internally within your cap table, and then take a calculated decision that okay, turns out 80% of all of my shareholders already have a demat account that they operate, which is on NSDL. So most likely I'll dematerialize on NSDL, and I'll then ask maybe those remaining balance 20% shareholders to hopefully open NSDL demat accounts to kind of support us in this entire process. Or effectively just we wouldn't recommend this to everyone, but you could dematerialize on both the depositories as well, but that will increase your costs, that will increase the workload, etc. So not really recommended for a early stage organization. Any questions there?
No questions. Yeah, I agree on your point that somewhere we need to do the internal survey before going for the CDSL and SDL. But I just want to highlight there will be a practical challenge when you have the ESOPs that options is already exercised. So take an example, if you are a Series A or Series B startup company and you have employees that option exercised and you have a total number of employees somewhere around 600 or 700. So then you need to reach out to each and every one, and then you need to check whether they have an account in CDSL or NSDL. That is something a practical challenge will be there.
That is, I have a perfect shameless plug for that, but I'll come to that later. I'll talk about that later, how software and technology can help you streamline all of that. But yes. If I were to quickly just talk about the downside of not dematerializing, and of course we'll have an open-ended conversation and answer other questions later, but the important things, right? For unlisted startups, who, as I said, meet the required threshold, which is have at least 4 crores of paid up capital and 40 crores of revenue, or they are a Indian subsidiary of a foreign entity, or they're an NBFC, right? If you do not dematerialize by September 30th of this year, which is the current deadline, then of course, on the left side, you can see materially consequential restrictions, which are that you won't effectively, for all practical purposes, like you cannot issue new securities, which means you can't fundraise. You cannot conduct a buyback. You won't be able to conduct any secondary transactions. So no liquidity transactions effectively you can do, right? And even your existing shareholders won't be able to subscribe to additional shares. So if you were to do a rights issue in the future, and you haven't dematerialized while you're mandated to do it, then of course you'll be restricted from carrying out any sort of transaction from an equity standpoint. And then of course, the less relevant yet still, important, there are monetary fines as well, which is you'll be fined 10,000 rupees plus 1,000 rupees for each day of your violation, which is capped at 2 lakh rupees. And every officer within a company is responsible to pay a fine up to 50,000 rupees. So of course, for all practical purposes, this 2.5 lakh rupees of a fine, right? It's not as big as the opportunity cost of not being able to, let's say, conduct a fundraise as a startup, right? Because of course, liquidity matters. That's as a builder, that's your prime focus, right? So blocking yourself from security transaction, that is a larger threat, right? And that's a larger, I suppose, penalty that gets imposed if you do not dematerialize before September 30th of 2024. On that note, on that note, I want to highlight that, as I said, there are 2 phases of dematerializing, right? The first is where you create ISINs for every security that you issue. And the second is where you actually submit the share certificates, get them destroyed, and push shares into demat accounts, right? So think of them in 2 phases. For all all practical purposes, you speak with 3 people in the ecosystem, you won't be able to find consensus on it. And that's because of some sort of ambiguity right now, is that there's still not insane clarity whether you need to conduct both phase 1 and phase 2 by September 30th of 2024. No 2 people will tell you the same thing. And I would say that those who are actually more practical, working with like a larger cohort of companies, or have direct channels with RTAs, or even depositories such as ourselves, to an extent, from that perspective, we know one thing for sure, that it's most important for you to conduct your phase 1, get your ISINs created. That is what the regulators really care immediately, which is that the company has embarked on the process. It's generated ISINs. So now the regulators at least know the different types of securities that you have issued. And then of course, coordinating with the shareholders, getting them to courier the certificates, or you as a company to courier the certificates, and then push the demat account. That's an ongoing process. Typically getting an ISIN generated, right? This happens at an individual share class level. So of course you have to submit paperwork for individual share classes, and your dematerialization partner will help you do all of that stuff. But typically, if you have the right docket prepared, you can wrap up phase 1 within maybe 3 to 4 weeks, right? I would say 2 to 3 weeks, but I would have said 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 2 months ago. Right now, there's an insane pipeline of companies who have submitted information and paperwork. I believe the last we checked, like CDSL itself had a backlog of 300 plus companies at least who were waiting for some sort of confirmation, right? So there's an insane backlog that's piling on as as the deadline approaches. So I think the regulators, what they really care about right now is that you've embarked on the journey, you've gotten the ISINs created, while pushing the shares to the demat account for shareholders. That will eventually happen. Now the shameless plug, but at least what we have tried to do at EquityList is we have tried to simplify this entire workflow. So as a reminder, we are effectively an operating system for equity management, which means companies manage their cap table, stock options, and that entire securities ledger on our platform. And by the virtue of that, we have already streamlined or done the heavy lifting for majority of this operation, which is consolidating all of your data into one place, right? Understanding your active securities And I used to answer your question, like the whole survey, etc., seems pretty complex, or even understanding which employee has demat in which, like a depository participant network. It's a pretty cumbersome process. We have productized and streamlined all of that. So conducting, like this quick survey with your investors to understand, like the percentage of split between CDSL and NSDL, accordingly collecting all of that data, pushing that cap table data to the RTA that we have partnered with. We work with K Fintech, CDSL Ventures, and LinkedIn Time. So the idea is that we are able to help out companies in this entire process, and we are your dematerialization partner. So you don't have to deal with DP, depository, RTA. We are the ones doing all of the heavy lifting for you. And of course, the backward arrow is that if tomorrow there's ever any query resolution that the depository has, maybe they ask you to furnish more information. So we do all of that liaising on your behalf as well.
Got it. Do you think, Kashish, there are certain operational changes that startup founders should keep in mind now they raise funds after post dematerializing, or anything, anything that they should be really, really particular about because now that the paradigm has changed?
I would say that there are those founders, and we have come across a lot of founders who have dematerialized from the get-go, which means that they weren't even required to dematerialize, yet they did.
Yep.
Mostly the trend we have seen is that those founders hail from a fintech background, especially within the security space. So they've worked at a brokerage or a wealth, like some sort of a fintech financial services background where they've been aware of dematerialization as a concept from long ago. And I believe that's more of a founder DNA where they choose to take those calls immediately upfront. Having said that, majority, let's be honest, right? Majority of the companies, like as a founder, you already have 20 million things to do. You're not going to take this on your plate unless it's absolutely necessary, which is where if you meet this the threshold and therefore the deadline applies to you. Any founder that has a option, whether they can dematerialize for now or they can push it off until they have to, our personal recommendation is that don't do it. And the reason why is that a lot more other stakeholders in the ecosystem still need to be dematerialization ready. For example, if I'm a seed stage startup and I intend to raise funds both from India and outside, right? So of course, getting a demat account open in India for all the shareholders is supremely easy. But for a foreign shareholder, getting their Indian PAN card created, getting their Indian demat account created, right? Do I really want to block off that access to the foreign capital, at a crucial juncture of my company building where honestly dematerialization is good to have and it's not even mandatory? Most likely not, right? I don't want to put myself in that limbo. So as an early stage startup, no matter how I think optimistic you are about the ecosystem, give it a year or two or more, because here's what's going to happen. Most of the foreign investors who are already invested in the country, right? So we're talking about all of the major funds, right? Like all of the large institutional investors, even micro funds who have exposure into India. Like for example, if a company is raised through a syndicate from AngelList US, or a company has raised through Y Combinator or whatever. I mean, for Y Combinator, you have to flip outside. But still, the point is those who have been actively investing in the Indian ecosystem would have had to, create their demat account, get their Indian PAN card already. And most likely within the next 2 years, so most of those players in the ecosystem would be dematerialization ready, which means that they'll be ready to support dematerialized companies because they'll already have their Indian PAN card created. They'll already have their demat accounts created, right? So without being a hindrance to the company. As far as companies that have to comply, the only paradigm that they really have to think about is, or at least keep in their mind, is that dematerialization is not a one-time process. You're doing the heavy lifting of converting your physical shares into electronic, which is a one-time heavy lift. But every year there are minor filings, there are compliances, right? You still are interacting with the depository as well as your RTA, right? And we'll show a quick glimpse of the costs around that as well. So this is a lifelong commitment of sorts that you have done, right? So you can't lose the ball that, okay, I've done it now, I can sit back. The point is that you work with partners who ensure that you don't fall off the track.
Got it. So this means that even startups have to be careful about investors who are dematerialization ready?
100%.
Got it. So, I mean, as in, so operationally for a founder is supposed to be wary of who he's raising funds from, essentially.
Yeah, another simple way to put it, if I'm an early stage founder, if I don't have to dematerialize because of I don't meet the eligibility criteria for a deadline, I honestly should not do it, because then most likely most of the foreign investors that could have invested in my Indian company might be blocked out.
Got it. Got it. Pretty
Because
interesting.
it's going to take them time to get their PAN cards, etc., created, especially if they're investing in the country for the first time.
Got it.
Other than the fact that it's a mandate, I think the statistics speak for themselves, right? For one DP, there are like at least 2,800 companies right now that they have to serve. And I mean, honestly, I think the CDSL backlog that we shared with you, that itself is pretty stark, right? So I think get started on this ASAP, especially if you know for sure that the eligibility criteria is relevant for you. Even if you anticipate that most likely you're going to do a fundraise in Q4 of this year or early next quarter, at least engage in the process. Get your cap table, etc., streamlined. Be ready for the paperwork, because when you'll have to do it, then it's just being ready is much better than like scurrying at the end. Quick FAQs. Sorry, I know we're probably over time right now, but a quick FAQs is, people ask how many ISINs do I need to create? Just look at all of the securities that you have, all of the types of securities that you have. Every single, of course, there's one common equity, common stock that you give to founders, and even employees get post exercising of options. That's one layer. So that's one ISIN that you have to create. And then for every single CCPS round that you may have done with different maturity dates and with different terms and conditions, right? Like in SHA that founders execute, every CCPS has different rights, right? Like maybe your Series A will have better lick pref rights, better exit rights. Maybe they'll have a lot more information rights than your seed CCPS holders. So the TNCs vary now at every security level, right? Plus the maturity date of the CCPS, because CCPS, by the way, for those, it's these are compulsory convertible preferential shares. These are shares that need to convert into equity eventually at the time of liquidity and an exit. So they have to convert within the next 19 to 20 years at least. So there's a different timer that every CCPS is working on. So basically, every single round that you have done where you have issued CCPS with varying terms, you have to dematerialize those. If you have issued OCDs, MCDs, OCPRS, any type of security which is distinctive in nature, you need a ISIN for it. Should small companies opt for dematerialization? I believe I've already answered. Only do this if you have to. What is the process for an Indian subsidiary of a foreign entity? I think this is relevant for few people as well. First and foremost, what you have to ensure is that for your Indian subsidiary, you most likely only have one share class, which is the equity common stock. In that Indian subsidiary, it's pretty much just like two promoters, maybe the foreign holding, and nothing else there. So you need to get ISIN generated for that one entity. But for your US parent company that has ownership in this Indian subsidiary, right? You'll need to get its Indian PAN card created, and you need to get its Indian demat account created as well. That has a separate process, and any offline member which has such cross-border structure, we'd love to provide, I think, like a clinical session of sorts where we'll help you understand all of the requirements for such a structure, and even work with partners in getting your PAN cards, etc., and all of those relevant details created. And what are the costs involved? I'm just sharing a quick glimpse of the statutory stat costs that you'll have to pay to either NSDL, CDSL, or RTA. Some of these are one-time charges, right? Some of these are one-time security deposits that you're paying. Some of these are annual custody charges. So these are pretty much annual recurring charges that you'll have to pay. And of course, these one-time and annual charges are both applicable to either of the NSDL or CDSL, and even the RTA that you work with. So here I've mentioned K-Fintech, it could be any other RTA. As you can see, your first year costs are slightly on the high side with a lot of one-time charges, but as you progress forward, then your costs will only increase on the number of ISINs that you have. Once again, any company that's undergoing, we're happy to work with them and help them figure out the costs. Yeah. One thing we have done, and I think when we do share this presentation with the rest of the offline members, you can just click on our click on our dematerialization eligibility quiz, which we have on our website. Answer a few questions there, and just for sure know whether you have to dematerialize or not. That's about it.
Cool. I just have one more question. I don't know if how do I exactly put it so that it's sensible enough. But I'm sure you would be aware about community stock option plans that were rolled out by Type back in the day.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, how do you think dematerialization would anyway facilitate or affect or, coincide with equity crowdfunding in any manner? Or the retail investor.
With my understanding, and maybe I may need to brush up on a few things, but first of all, crowdfunding for a unlisted entity in India it's not regulated.
Yeah.
First and foremost, right? And with like the said partner in the ecosystem that you mentioned, most likely had to come up with a pretty creative way of making that happen, where the underlying security itself, I believe there were some sort of phantom stocks. I'm not sure, right? But for all practical purposes, Sarvagya wasn't a great, I suppose, mechanism of fundraising anyway in the first place.
Yeah.
Highly unregulated. SEBI will do 110% crackdown, most likely, on spaces that, it's just that SEBI is not ready for. Right? And not to mention retail investors investing at 20, 30, 50,000 rupees. I have pretty extreme views on all of that. So I'm going to spare those remarks. But dematerialization, what it will eventually enable. So here's the thing, right? I think the most viable, the better example is what will happen with unlisted public companies, right? Unlisted public companies are entities that have more than 200 investors, right? They aren't being traded on the stock market, but they have to follow regulations, more or less, and all of the disclosures that are applicable to listed companies, right? Now, in that case, they could have 500, 600, 800 investors on their cap table. So the intent of the idea of mobilizing and be dematerialization ready would be supremely difficult, but at least they will be able to hopefully attract future fundraise audiences, which already are, attuned to this process, who already have demat accounts, and just make the process a lot more seamless. And they anyway, by the way, were mandated to do so, right? Like they anyway had to dematerialize their shares. Yeah, I think this is more paradigm shifting for investors in the unlisted space, private unlisted space, where so far the only thing you really had were unit statements or just like one paperwork to show you how much you owned in a company, and uske alawa kuch nahi, right? So that's a painful experience.
Got it. And what do you think in the entire process of dematerializing the shares? What is the most painful process amongst all the processes, and does EquityList help out with that?
Yeah. So if you already use a cap table software, I think the first hurdle is sorted, which means all of your data is collated in one place. If you haven't used a cap table software before and you're managing everything offline, and especially if you've been in existence for like 6, 7, 8+ years, where your company secretary has changed 3 times in that course of action, and there's no streamlined data, then consolidating all of that itself is a challenge, because there's a lot of context loss. But assuming that's done, I would say the most painful one would be doing the surveys of your shareholders and understanding who owns which demat account on which depository, right? Like how many are on NSDL and how many are on CDSL, because you'll accordingly have to convince the minority folks on a particular network on why they'll have to create new demat accounts. And then of course, hopefully, you will be involved in that liaising process to make it easier for your shareholders to open new demat accounts. Or worst case, which is not entirely a worst case, you need to dematerialize on both NSDL and CDSL, which increases your costs. But the biggest problem, honestly, I think in this entire process is phase 2, which is once the ISINs are created, then effectively taking a stock of where the share certificates are. Have you issued it to a shareholder, or do you as a company are safekeeping them? Coordinating with your shareholders, because your shareholders will need to individually fill out the DRF forms, right? And let's say you have 50 shareholders, 10 are on ICICI Securities, 20 are on HDFC, 30 are on IIFL, some new folks are on Zerodha and Grow, right? So now you'll have to tell all of them that, hey, these are DRF forms that you could go download from your depository networks websites, or from apps. You got to fill it out, and you got to fill out the security information.
And all of this happens like on an individual basis.
On an individual basis, and then you have to courier the DRF form along with the certificate, the physical certificate. You got to courier it to the depository network's address. So you'll have to courier it to the HDFC Securities corporate office, etc., where they've asked you to courier that.
Right.
So that logistical problem itself is pretty meaty, especially the larger the cap table that you have. What we have done is, since we provide shareholder dashboards, that security data is already there. As of today, anyone can go there and they can see how many distinctive number of shares they've been given, and all of that granular data that they'll ask you to fill out in the DRF form.
Right.
Of course, we can't courier it for them, but soon at least we are hoping to plug in ShipRocket APIs or whatever to make that logistics also, solve itself out.
Got it. So as in the tediousness of the entire process is also directly proportional to the size of the company. Is that so?
100%. I would say size of the company and the vintage of the company. The longer the company has existed, slightly more archaic it has become, right? And just the chances of data being lost and being just misrepresented here and there. That's problematic.
Got it. That is about it from my end. Sahil, do you have any questions?
No, and I mean, pretty detailed, but essentially, with the whole fine thing, you said the upper limit is 2 lakh rupees. So basically, I mean, if I come to think of it, there is no downside of not doing this right now. Basically, all you would have to do is, whenever you are fundraising and you want to do this, basically it'll be mandatory for you to do this before, pay a fee or pay a fine of 2 lakh rupees, and then basically get this done, right? तो ऐसा urgency, तो basically urgency उस time पे create हो जाएगी, but अभी people I think will still take it very lightly in general, right?
Yeah, I don't think that people are taking it lightly for two reasons. A lot of the pressure is coming top down from existing investors, especially institutional investors. Because as of April of this year, so by the way, just like how unlisted companies have their own deadline to dematerialize, Indian AIFs had the deadline of April of this year, April end of this year, to dematerialize their AIF units for their LPs.
Okay. Yeah.
So now every single stakeholder that's part of this capital market, essentially in this listed space, has been mandated to dematerialize at a certain level, which means that even if as a company, I, play it smart, just like, how you're thinking and treading along those lines, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm going to chill out. I'm not going to fund this for the next 2 years, but your investors most likely going to ask you, right? Like, hey, what's up? And then do you really want to have those conversations? Because of course, the last thing the ecosystem also needs are just founders, who take compliances and corporate diligence very lightly. Second is that if tomorrow, in case of contingencies, you really have to do some sort of a transaction, you'll be prohibited from doing that, right? You'll have to pay the fines. These are bureaucratic processes. They could take a long time than anticipated. So it creates unnecessary hurdle and paperwork. And, it's just, honestly, we'll get to know how painful this will become once September ends, once we actually get a formal circulation from the government and from, MCA in general. I think we'll get to know the magnitude then.
Got it. And just as a reference point for a seed stage company, or for a seed stage to a Series A stage company, how much of a total time will it take for this whole process to get completed, just as a tentative timeline?
Yeah. So getting your ISINs generated, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks as of today, because there's a good amount of backlog with the depositories itself. So even if you push everything, you've got to think of at least 1 month, more or less, just to get your ISINs sorted. And this is assuming that, the depository does not get back, the depository being NSDL or CDSL does not get back to the RTA with
Right.
queries of missing data, etc. So that will
Correct.
further increase. And then once this is done, then depending on how many investors you have, if you have 10, 20, easier to coordinate. But if there's so many Series A cap tables with 80 plus investors,
Of course.
then that's going to take some time. So it's best to at least get that coordination and orchestration going up front.
Okay.
And it's best to believe that it will be a continuous process for some time, right? Even if you get 95% of your investors to fill out the DRF, submit the certificates,
Right.
maybe those 5% of your investors are still delaying it out for you, which is fine.
Right.
It's just that they won't be maybe able to participate in future transactions, etc. There could be certain limitations on those folks because like wherever they're lost in that process and they have to do it at some point.
Makes sense. What? I think I'm sorted.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. We're always available. In case of any questions, you can reach out.
Yeah, I think if something comes up, we'll send them your way. I think we can stop the recording, just internal teams now.